Hello friend, before starting the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. This may seem like a small step, but for us it is the key to success. Enjoy listening.
The room was dark. Only a single candle burned at the corner of the table. Crooked shadows danced on the wall. Shadows like life, long, bent, sometimes losing their true shape. The air hung heavy with the scent of old paper, dried ink, and wood defeated by time. That smell, that stillness, created a space conducive to thought. And that night there was no sound but thoughts. A young man would be afraid to sit in such a room. But fear, desire, even hope, all fall from a person's face and hands with age. Only that heavy burden called experience remains. And secrets, everyone has one. Some secrets are small, ordinary whispers. Others are heavy enough to change an entire life. Here, in this old armchair, sits an old man carrying the whole weight of life. His voice is calm, but behind every word there is a story, a torment, perhaps a regret. He tells his life like someone else's story. He analyzes his mistakes as if they were the mistakes of his children, his companions. And every time he wants to say I, he bites his tongue and says he, because he no longer has the strength to look at himself, to judge himself. This story is his last word. And within these words, the secret that caused his death is hidden. Listen, the story begins. Youth. What a foolish courage youth is. As if the world revolves around you, and you are the hero at its center. Back then, it seemed thought that time was infinite and choices eternal. But we were wrong. The greatest mistake in life is thinking you have time. You do not have time. You have only enough time to take a breath. And that young man never understood that. He made his first great mistake at that moment. He loved, incredibly, foolishly, forgetting himself. He loved. But love does not mean forgetting yourself. On the contrary, love should teach a person to love themselves more. If that young man had understood that, he would not have spoken the words that struck that beautiful woman's heart like a stone. Those words destroyed both her and himself. But that is the subject of another story. And that story is one of the secrets that will be told tonight. How could he say those words? No need to ask. The answer is always the same. Pride. That toxic, featherless pride of youth. When the girl told him, "Go, see the world, and return to me with confidence," that young man perceived it as a test, as an insult. He thought his love, his being, were not enough. With a hard expression, without looking into her eyes, as if firing a bullet that would kill himself, he said, "Fine, I'll go, but know this, I will not return. Every moment without you is a renunciation of you, and I renounce nothing, no one." Words like stone, cold, irreversible, carved. The moment he said them, he felt a part of his heart break off. But stepping back, softening his words, that would have been a sign of weakness. He didn't want to be weak. He wanted to look strong. The greatest weakness is precisely that, wanting to appear strong. The girl said nothing. She simply bowed her head with infinite melancholy in her eyes. That nod was like a queen showing mercy to a king who had lost her trust. In that instant, everything ended. The young man left. He did not look back. Had he looked, he would have seen the light of freedom in her eyes, not sorrow. But he did not look. Years passed, The opposite of those words never sounded again. They sank like a stone into the depths of the sea and remained there. But sometimes, especially on quiet nights, if a fish brushed that stone or a wave swept it, you can hear the sound it makes. Very quiet, but very deep. Not like a song, like a moan. Thus the first great mistake was made. The door closed. But it was not the only door. There are always other doors in life. The young man convinced himself that by closing that door, he would never look back. But a secret. No one can truly manage never to look back. Those who most loudly claim, "I do not look back," are the ones who look the most. The shadows shifted. No longer the small shadows of the house, but long, vague shadows playing under the lights of unknown, distant cities. Everything was new for the young man. The air, the smells, people's voices. Even the sound of his own breath felt different. This was a true escape from the life he had fled. Or so he thought. He threw himself into work. He worked hard, because work is the best excuse not to think. His hands hardened, his face became steady, and his eyes never fully lit up. Others spoke of his success, his determination. They praised him, but no one saw that each of his actions, each decision, was a kind of repetition of those final words. Go, do not return, renounce feelings. At night, alone in bed, the girl's eyes would come before him. That bowed head, that quiet yet terrible comprehension. Sometimes he would turn her in his imagination and break his pride. "Forgive me," he would say. "Without you, I have nothing." But in the morning, that weakness would withdraw behind the wall, and he would be the same stern, resolute man again. Then he met another woman, attractive outwardly, radiant. He spoke with her. They smiled. The young man told himself, "This is it. This is the chance to forget my old life. A new beginning." But the beginning was not a beginning. It was a continuation. The continuation of repeating old mistakes. He drew close to her. He loved her, or he performed the act of loving. He did not truly feel it. This time he did not know he was making a mistake. He had lied to himself so often that he could no longer choose the truth. This new woman was a mirror for him. But in that mirror, he did not want to see himself. He wanted to see the face of his first love, standing behind him. That was the greatest injustice, both to himself and to that new, sun-like woman. But injustice becomes a habit. So time passed. The hollow vessel called success filled day by day. But inside there was nothing, only silence and a secret. That secret was hidden in the small letter he always carried in his pocket and never opened. He had not read it yet. He had sworn to read it when he felt strong enough. But when are you ever strong enough? What was that letter for him? A protest, a hope, or a torture device? No one could know. Yet he carried it. Each day he moved it from one pocket to another. When he put on new clothes, his first act was to slide the letter into the new pocket. The paper slowly aged, its corners softened. It acquired its own peculiar scent. The letter had become part of him, yet its contents remained foreign. He toyed with himself. "I'll read it today," he would say upon waking. But by noon, he'd deceive himself. "I am not strong enough." By evening, he'd postpone again. "I'll think more clearly tomorrow." Thus years passed. The letter was the physical manifestation of the door he had closed in his heart. Opening it would mean opening that door, and he was afraid of what lay beyond. Maybe it contained forgiveness and love. That thought scared him more. Accepting forgiveness would mean admitting the magnitude of his mistake. Maybe it contained anger and reproach. That was frightening too. To read anger would mean seeing that melancholy in her eyes again, this time written down. If he were someone else, he might have burned the letter or thrown it into a river. But he could not, because the letter was his last tie to that woman. To lose it would be to lose her entirely. Carrying the letter felt like keeping something still together. At last, one day, news arrived. A short message from someone he knew in the village. The girl had passed away. Illness. Swift. She hadn't suffered much. That night, the young man, now not so young, sat alone in his room, the unopened letter in his hand. He felt neither anger, nor sorrow, nor remorse. Only a vast emptiness, as if the whole world had fallen into silence. Then, with trembling hands, he tore the envelope. He took out the paper, opened it, and read. The letter was very brief. Only one sentence written. If you leave, I will die too. But if you are reading this, it means life wants to give us both another chance. Come beneath it was a date, exactly 20 years earlier. When he read the letter, it was 20 years after the day it had been written. He had missed that chance, consumed by his own pride, his cowardice. It was not the letter itself, but his lack of courage to read it that killed him. That night the man died. The last light inside him went out. Only a shadow remained, and a shadow carrying this secret. After that date, everything turned colorless. The world became monochrome, the color of ash. Waking each morning felt like lifting the body of the dead from the ground. Each breath became a torment, a reminder of time lost. But no one could see it, for he continued to perform on his stage. He had achieved success, wealth, influence, all of it. People surrounded him, admirers, those who wanted to spend time with him. But they watched the spectacle he created, not the shadow. He had fashioned a persona for himself, wise, calm, a man who solved everything in his own time. No one felt the emptiness in him, that thin skin. And that woman, that first and last love. Nobody spoke her name. Her memory, that unopened letter, were thrown into a deep well and covered. But at night sounds came from that well. Every small detail that recalled her, the scent of a flower, a distant song, the sound of rain on a window, pulled him toward the well's edge. He would ask himself, if I had opened the letter in time, what would have happened? Would I have returned? Perhaps yes. Perhaps she had been waiting. Perhaps her death notice was a lie, a test. But no. All such thoughts are empty fantasies. Truth does not bend to wishful thinking. The truth is, there was a chance, and he destroyed it. To live with that thought was a constant torment. So he threw himself into work, into more work. New projects, new contracts, new countries. But wherever he went, the scent of that letter went with him, like his shadow. Then he made a greater mistake. He convinced himself he could fill that void with someone else. He married that radiant woman. It was the greatest injustice to both her and himself. He never truly loved her. He only tried to forget himself through her, used her as a filler. The woman sensed it. One day she said, "I am alone beside you. Where are you? You are always somewhere else." He could not answer, because the answer lay far away in an old letter in another time. Thus he ruined another life. But this time he was not alone. The effect of his mistake flowed into a distant future without his awareness. And that current would bring him, on this night, to this room, to this candlelight. The end of the story approached. As time went by, the shadows lengthened further. Not only the shadows cast by sun and candle, but inner shadows. Shadows produced by the injustices, lies, and silences one does to oneself. Each day, the old man looked into the mirror and saw the emptiness in his own eyes. But he did not ask why, for he already knew the answer too well. The crack between the persona he had created and the real man grew bigger. Outwardly, he gained respect and success, but inwardly, he was defeated. When others praised his calm, wise nature, he laughed silently. If only they knew that his calm was actually despair, and his wisdom a peace torn from the depths of regret. At that time, something strange happened. In his room, especially in the evening hours, flicker-like shadows appeared. Shadows only he could see. Silhouettes playing on the wall that did not belong to any light source. Sometimes the silhouette of a woman, sometimes the outlines of distant places. At first he blamed fatigue and stress, but the shadows became clearer, more persistent. One evening, as he sat at the table looking over papers, he felt a shadow on the wall. This time, it was different. It did not move. It simply stood there, looking at him. His chest tightened. Slowly, he turned his head. The shadow did not vanish. On the contrary, it grew denser. All surrounding sounds stopped. Only the beating of his own heart could be heard. He knew that shadow. It was the shadow of the future he had lost years ago, but that had never truly belonged to him. The shadow of himself. The man he could have been in another life. Happier, more whole, more real. The shadow did nothing, said nothing. It only looked, and in that look, there was neither anger nor mercy, only an infinite calm and understanding. It was an understanding he had never seen. He had never forgiven himself like that. Yet that shadow seemed to forgive him. He rested his hands on the table and rose. As he stepped toward the shadow, it retreated, as if drawing him deeper. Finally, the shadow stopped by a shelf on the wall, and then vanished. On the shelf there was only one thing, a dusty, forgotten picture frame. There was no picture in it. It was empty. But that emptiness told the entire story. He picked up the frame. His hands trembled. He suddenly felt that these shadow plays were not merely imagination. They were warnings, invitations, perhaps opportunities. But opportunities for what? Death, living, self-forgiveness? He didn't know the answer, but he knew this was the beginning of an ending. Or perhaps the beginning of a true beginning. He held the empty frame, his fingers stuck to the dusty glass, as if all the past, all lost moments were kept inside this frame, and it had a key he had not found. The shadow had gone, but its feeling remained. The room was colder. The candlelight flickered, and an invisible breath seemed to want to blow it out. Why had he kept that frame? He could not remember, perhaps in the hope of one day filling it. But no picture or memory could ever fill that void. because what should have been captured there was never allowed to be taken. He had destroyed those moments with his own hands. He placed the frame on the table and sat opposite it, as if wanting to ask it, "What should I see? What should I understand?" he asked in silence. And at that moment, the shadow returned. But this time it was not alone. Two shadows formed on the wall. One his own shadow, the other that familiar, calm, understanding shadow. The two stood side by side, but between them, there was a small, eternal distance. Then the shadows moved. His shadow went forward alone. The other stayed. His shadow grew, rose, and covered the whole wall. Success, power, prestige. But the small, calm shadow did not change. It remained a forgotten dot at the hem of the big shadow. Suddenly, the big shadow began to fragment. It fell apart into large pieces and dropped to the floor. Nothing remained on the ground. Only that small, calm shadow remained. Then it too gradually faded and vanished. He watched this play of shadows and finally understood. This was the portrait of his life. He had enlarged himself and made himself important, but he had not truly changed. The real self, that small, quiet part, had not developed or grown, and when the outer success collapsed, nothing was left, only emptiness. This realization shook him, not death, but something worse than death, acknowledging that his life was empty. But the shadows were not finished. They reformed. This time the small shadow began to grow. Gradually, quietly, it covered the whole wall. And this time, it did not fragment. It remained steady. Within it, there was neither pride nor fear, only presence. This was another choice, one he could have made, but never did. The shadow showed that there had always been another way in his life. He had not chosen that way, but that did not mean the way did not exist. He looked at the frame, the empty frame. Suddenly he realized that this frame should not be filled, because his story is not told by pictures but by words, memories, regrets. And that night he must finally tell that story, with all its secrets. The shadows disappeared. The room quieted once more. Only the sound of the candle burning remained. He took paper and a pen. He had to begin to write. His confession, his warning, his secret. But he knew writing alone was not enough. The story would not be complete. The greatest secret still remained unopened. That secret concerned his death, and that would be the subject of the next part. The pen slid quietly over the paper. Each letter, each word felt like a heavy, slow drop wrung from pain. But with every written word, the great stone in his heart grew a little lighter, as if this confession before death freed him. What he wrote was a letter with no recipient. To his son. Number. His son was already too far from the chance to forgive him. To the world? The world would be indifferent. This confession was for himself. To be honest with himself one last time. To be faithful to himself. He wrote the truths he had run from all his life. How he lost that woman. How he carried her letter in his pocket and buried it with her. How even on the day his son was born, he longed for another life. He wrote about the injustice he did to his wife. How even in her warm arms he felt cold and alone. And about his son, he wrote of his deepest fear toward him. As his son grew, he began to see in the boy's eyes that same calm, understanding look. the look from his first love's final gaze. It drove him mad. He fled from his son. He became a cold, distant father. Because his son was the living proof of his greatest failure, the inability to accept love. As he wrote, the shadows tried to play again, but this time he did not yield. Writing became his weapon, truth his light. He looked at the words and said, "I see you. I know what you are. You are my past, my regrets, but you will no longer rule me." The shadows drew back. Only the carefree flicker of the candle remained. Finally, he reached the end of his writing, but he had not yet written the heaviest part, his death. For it was not accidental, it was a choice. A few months earlier, the doctors had told him, "The illness is progressing rapidly. You will not feel pain." That news did not startle him then. On the contrary, he felt relief, as if life were giving him one last chance, this time to make the right choice, not to face death, but to choose it himself. But first, he had to write everything. He had to leave these writings to his son. Perhaps one day his son would read them and be different from his father. Perhaps one day he would learn to accept love. He finished. He gathered the papers, placed them into a thick envelope, and wrote his son's name on it. Then he stood by the table. The candlelight was already fading. The room was nearly dark. And now it was time for the final act, the most mysterious part of the story. The end drew near. The room was now completely dark. Only a faint point of light trembled on the table, like the candle's final breath. The air was heavy with the smell of burned wool and old paper. Everything was still. It was as if time had paused to await this final moment. He rose from the old armchair, tired and painful, yet he had never felt so purposeful. This was his last journey, not toward death, but toward fidelity to himself. He picked up the empty picture frame from the table. He looked at it one last time. It had been the symbol of his life, a beautiful frame, empty inside. But now he had the chance to fill that emptiness with meaning, by his own choice. He placed the frame on the floor and crushed it with his foot. The glass shattered and the wood splintered. The sudden, sharp sound pierced the silence. This was his last rebellion against the past. He would no longer be its captive. Then, he took the letter written to his son. He placed it in the finest spot on the table where the candlelight fell. He was sure his son would find it. Maybe he would not understand. Maybe he would not forgive. But that would no longer be his choice. He had done his part. The candlelight dwindled further. He approached the window. Moonlight whitened the streets outside and cast shadows. But this time the shadows did not frighten him. They simply were. In the distance, under an old street lamp, a shadow caught his eye. The shape was familiar, too distant to see details, but his heart recognized it. It was not the shadow of his first love, nor his son's. It was the shadow of his own youth, the young man before all mistakes, before shutting doors. The shadow raised a hand toward him. It was neither an invitation nor a threat, just a greeting, an acquaintance, perhaps an agreement. He bowed to that shadow. Then he opened the window. Cold, fresh air filled the room, made the candle flicker one last time, and extinguished it. The room was now in total darkness, but he was not afraid. He feared nothing anymore. He moved toward the table in the dark, feeling the rustle of broken glass underfoot. He reached out and took the remaining, still warm piece of wax. This was his last torch. He left the room. Barefoot, he walked silently across the wooden floor. Why? To where? This was the final secret of the story, and it would go with him. Behind him, on the writing desk, the letter to his son waited under the candle's last drop. And so the old man set off on his last journey, down a dark corridor by the light of the small piece of candle, alone. Bare feet were silent on the wooden floor. Only if one listened closely could they hear the faint whistle of his breath. The candle's small flame advanced before him down the dark corridor, making dancing shadows on the walls. They were no longer frightening, merely companions. He descended. The house was quiet and empty, everything in its place, yet everything looked like a memory, a half-truth. This house had never been just a house. It had been a mirror, an illusion. He stepped outside into the cold air. He walked under the pale light of street lamps. His feet were chilled on the stony road, but this chill was the final real sensation that woke him. The candlelight illuminated old benches in the street. Where was he going? He had no firm purpose, but his feet carried him to the foundation, the outskirts of the city, to a place buried deep in memories. At last he stopped in front of an old park, the very place where he had first met that girl many years ago. Same trees, same wooden benches. Time here seemed to have stopped. He sat on one of the benches. He set the candle beside him. The flame flickered but did not go out. He closed his eyes and returned to the past. He remembered that day, her laughter, her hopes, the excitement, that infinite sense of possibility in the young man's heart. And suddenly he understood something. What he had sought all those years was not forgiveness, not from the girl, nor his son, nor even from himself. He had sought to be understood, to have someone who understood what the young man felt, who knew why he made those mistakes. But the only one who could truly understand him was himself. He opened his eyes. The candle's flame now burned more brightly, as if mocking all the darkness. He laid his hand on the top of the candle. It was warm, real. Then, very quietly, he extinguished the candle. But the darkness was not complete. On the other side of the park, lights were already burning in windows. One, then another. The city was waking. He sat on the bench and watched the first light of dawn whiten the sky. No anger, no sorrow, no remorse remained in his heart. Only a vast, infinite silence. When the sun rose, he stood. He did not go back home. He walked forward, toward the new day, barefoot, hands empty, but with a full heart. Neither death nor self-destruction was his end. His end was accepting the truth, forgiving himself. He returned home. His son's letter still lay on the desk. He picked it up, held it for a moment, then gently put it back. Reading it was no longer his task. Sunlight poured through the window. The room was no longer dark and cold. It was warm and clear. The old man sat in the armchair and smiled. For the first time, it was a truly genuine smile, and thus the story ended. But this was not the end. It was a beginning, because at last he had really begun to live. The secret is this: the greatest secret is not to keep things hidden, but to face your truth.